Hi, this is Troy Hunt, and I'd like to talk to you about insider threats. This is a risk that we face in every organization today, and insiders play a role in a huge proportion of the security incidents that we see every single day. In this course, we're going to look at various attributes of the enemy within. So we're going to start out by looking at where insider threats originate from. And it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying that they always originate from inside. We're going to talk about some of the assets that are targeted via these insider threats, and then talk about the role of malicious insiders. There's a few key motivators that these individuals have. But not every insider is malicious either. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about unintentional insiders. So individuals within organizations that end up playing a role in serious security incidents entirely by accident. Now, whether the insider is malicious or unintentional, we still have this component of insider threats, which is data exfiltration. So how does data actually leave the organization? We're going to look at a number of different channels there, and that's a pretty fundamental part of the mechanics of an insider threat. And then finally, I want to talk about defensive measures. So how do we actually stop this risk from happening in the first place? Or at the very least, how do we mitigate the damage that can be caused by insiders? So that's what we're going to cover. Let's jump into it and start talking about insider threats. Very quickly about me, before we get into the details of this risk. I am Troy Hunt. I spend a lot of my time training technology professionals in order to help them better secure their systems. I travel a lot, do a lot of talks around the world predominantly about security, and I do a lot of speaking and writing on the sorts of topics you're going to hear about in this course. You can find me on Twitter at Troy Hunt or via my blog, which is located at troyhunt.com. So that's enough about me. Let's jump into the course and start looking at those insider threats. Just a very quick definition here to be entirely clear about what I mean by an insider threat. As the name suggests, we are talking about someone that comes from within the organization, not always employees though. I'll talk more about that shortly. But this individual has inside information about various aspects of the organization. So they have information and access to systems and other privileges which set them apart from those who are not located within the organization. Now, as I just mentioned, this doesn't necessarily mean that they always have malicious intent. Sometimes they're perfectly honest, hard-working employees, and we'll come back to that class of insider a little bit later on in the course. For now, though, let me give you a perfect example of what an insider actually looks like. This is Greg Chung. He spent 30 years exfiltrating sensitive documents out of Boeing and providing them back to China. All told, he stole about $2 billion worth of secrets from Boeing. Eventually, when the FBI tracked him down, they found 250,000 sensitive aerospace documents hidden beneath his home. Now, this is a perfect example of an insider. Greg worked for Boeing. He was within the organization, literally physically within the organization. He was a trusted individual. He had access to very valuable trade secrets. As an insider, he was able to take those documents and then over a period of decades, send them off to China. Now, Greg later got sentenced to 16 years in prison, so it didn't work out real well for him eventually. But he did this for 30 years. And it's probably one of the most significant examples of just how damaging an insider can be to an organization. One of the things that insiders make us do is reconsider how we think about the security boundaries of an organization. Let me show you what I mean. In information security, we're increasingly coming to the realization that the perimeter has become irrelevant. So traditional thinking would consider a perimeter around an organization, and then within that organization we have various machines that are protected by that perimeter. So what we mean by this is that any external malicious parties are blocked from gaining access to the inside of an organization. Now that perimeter may be anything from physical controls, security gates, guards, locked doors, through to digital controls. Firewalls is a perfect example. But when we talk about an insider, the insider is already in the perimeter. So the question we have to start asking ourselves is, how do we defend against a risk that's already inside that perimeter? And that's why the title here is so important, the perimeter being irrelevant. Because if we just work on the assumption that the perimeter will save us, it entirely neglects the risk of the insider. Let me give you an example that perfectly illustrates this problem. I'm going to show you a lot of precedents throughout this course. Greg Chung was the first one, but this is another really interesting one. And it was written up by renowned security journalist Brian Krebs. Now back in 2012, Brian wrote about how you could buy access to the inside of Fortune 500 firms. And what he actually found was a service that was renting access to nearly 17,000 infected computers around the world. So these are computers that are already within the perimeter of the organization. The machines themselves have become the insiders, and you could buy access to these machines for very small amounts of money. Brian gives a great example of what this online marketplace looks like. In this image, there's a Windows server you can buy access to, and it actually happens to exist inside Cisco. This one was being sold for $4.55. We can see that price just over to the right of the screen. Cisco did actually confirm that this was a hacked server running RDP. And this is a really good example of just how compromised a perimeter can be when there's actually machines already in the environment being rented out to external malicious parties. Those parties are now insiders. They're inside the network. So hopefully the Greg Chung example and this rented compromised machine example here on Krebs's blog gives you a bit of a sense of what we mean by insiders. But there are many different classes of insider. So let's go and have a look at where those threats actually originate from. You may look at this title and think the answer is kind of obvious. Insider threats originate from inside the organization. But there's a lot more to it than that. Let me show you what I mean. When we talk about sources of insider, we most frequently think of the employee. So this is someone who works directly for the organization. They're probably physically inside the premises, and they may well have been coming and going from the organization every single day for years and years on end. But it's not always employees. We also have contractors. Now the contractor could work for a third party. So they may be employed by someone else and brought into the organization, again, quite possibly physically, just like the employee, and that may be anything from a very short term to months or even years. Probably the most famous example of a contractor who turned out to be an insider threat is this guy. Edward Snowden didn't work for the NSA. He worked for Booz Allen Hamilton. He was a contractor into the NSA. Now, regardless of your ideological views on whether Snowden should or should not have leaked the troves of documents that he took from the NSA, it is a perfect example of privilege misuse. He abused his access rights to retrieve and exfiltrate data that should have remained within the NSA. In fact, he also managed to persuade colleagues to provide him with their passwords too. So inevitably, he did a little bit of social engineering as well. The information that Snowden leaked and the consequent revelations about the way the NSA operates are one of, if not the, most famous examples of an insider leaking information. So that's employees and contractors. Let's have a look at another one. Partners. So have a think about the number of partner organizations that often end up gaining access to an organization's internal environment behind that perimeter. There's a very prominent example of this related to a major US retailer in 2013. Target had 40 million customer debit and credit cards stolen, and eventually the source of the intrusion was tracked down to a partner. In this case, it was an HVAC vendor, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. There are frequently dedicated partners which perform that function. The problem for Target in this case was that the HVAC vendor was the channel through which malicious software entered targets' network and infected their point-of-sale terminals. We may not usually think of partners as being insiders, but consider just how many points an organization's network is exposed by delegating certain tasks and responsibilities to external parties. When that happens, such as the case with Target, that external party becomes an insider. They have access to that internal environment, which external parties don't. Now, clearly, in the case of Target, the HVAC vendor had way too much access. And we'll talk later on about defensive mechanisms, which include restricting what resources insiders can actually connect to. But first of all, let's go and look at another kind of insider. Insiders are often used as proxies for outsiders. Let me show you what I mean. Let's imagine we have a threat actor. And in this case, what I mean by that is a malicious party who wants to cause harm to the organization in question. Now, this threat actor is external, so they're an outsider. But they're going to use an insider who exists within the perimeter of the organization to gain access to corporate assets. So in this case, the insider is actually the proxy. So there's some collusion going on here. The threat actor is relying on the insider. Now, it may be that the insider is willingly providing access to those corporate assets, but it also may be that the insider has no idea that they're being exploited by the threat actor. Either way, the bottom line is that that external party is now gaining access to the corporate assets. Those assets could be any number of valuable internal resources that the organization wants to protect. Let's move on and start having a look at what some of those assets typically are. So assets that are actively targeted by insiders. Let's start by going back to the Greg Chung example at the start of this course. Greg was after trade secrets from Boeing. They had very sensitive information related to the engineering work that Greg was involved in. And that's just one good example of a trade secret. Snowden was after trade secrets from the NSA, so how their signals intelligence programs worked, how they identified targets, how they monitored those targets. Those were trade secrets of the United States National Security Agency. And in that case, many of them were also classified government documents. Financial data is another type of asset insiders are particularly interested in. Now, this might be anything from the financial state of the company, which is really useful to competitors, through to data that may be useful for industrial espionage, all the way through to operating conditions, which could be extremely useful for predicting where their share price is going to go. Employee records is another great example. I see a lot of cases in my dealings with data breaches where identities are valuable, tradable commodities. Employee records are also enormously useful for adversaries who then want to move on to other classes of attack like a phishing attack or identity theft. There's a lot you can do with a comprehensive set of an organization's employee data. Software code is another really good example. This is valuable intellectual property. We've seen many cases before where insiders have exfiltrated an organization's code because it poses value. Often, it's particularly valuable to competitors. It's insider knowledge. Another thing that's really valuable to competitors is customer records. Organizations are always trying to discover information about their competitors, and internal records, which should remain private, are particularly valuable. If you can discover how many customers your competitor has, how much money they're paying, what their demographics are, that can provide a serious competitive advantage. Increasingly, another class of internal asset that's becoming very prominent and very valuable is health records. Now, this is significant firstly because this is a very sensitive class of data. We are talking about the health of individuals here. And secondly, because that data can be highly regulated. For example, via HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And HIPAA is there to help safeguard medical information because it is so valuable. So regulated data is a particularly valuable commodity to the insider. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it should get you thinking about just how much valuable information exists inside organizations and why insiders pose a threat. Let me give you a specific example of a really high-profile incident that covers a number of these different asset classes. This is what greeted Sony Pictures employees when they arrived at work in November 2014. This was malware running on their machines. So inside the organization, somehow this malicious software was introduced within the perimeter, possibly with the help of an insider, quite likely accidentally, so not necessarily malicious. But be that as it may, malware is very frequently dependent on the help of someone within the perimeter of the organization. As this event unfolded, the alleged attackers, GOP, the Guardians of Peace, claimed that they had been inside Sony Pictures network for a year. They had 12 months of being an insider, moving laterally within the environment and exfiltrating ginormous amounts of information from the organization. Now, in this case, the insider became a proxy for the attackers, who are largely believed to have been state-sponsored by the Democratic Republic of North Korea. And by having access to this information with inside Sony Pictures, they caused some serious damage. For example, the hack resulted in the public distribution of 5 unreleased movies. This is valuable intellectual property. In fact, this is exactly what Sony Pictures is there to create. And by virtue of this malicious software running inside the network, these were exfiltrated and then extensively torrented. It wasn't just movies though. There was some far more personal information taken out of Sony Pictures. The attackers also gained access to over 30,000 documents and 173,000 emails. And as you can see here from the headlines, some of the emails were explosive. In fact, they were so damaging to Amy Pascal, the Sony Pictures co-chair. She stepped down from her position shortly after the event. These were embarrassing emails, not just embarrassing emails from Sony Pictures employees, but from external parties as well. So for example, some of Amy's communications with producer Scott Rudin. This wasn't just Amy's communications being exposed to the world, it was Scott's as well. Executive communications like this can be extremely valuable, extremely damaging, as was the case here. But it begs this question that I ask myself and is interesting for you to ask yourself as well. What if every email in your mailbox was exposed publicly? How many years does it go back? What are some of the things that you might have said a decade ago that could one day be made public? It starts to make you feel pretty nervous as you try and recall the conversations that you had all those years ago. And in the case of Sony Pictures, it doesn't matter how far back those conversations went, because all of those emails suddenly became very easily discoverable. WikiLeaks stood up a search page. Anyone can still go there today and search through the private, personal communications of those Sony Pictures employees. This is the level of damage that an insider can do. And even if it's not malicious software installed by another nation's state, allegedly because they didn't like one of Sony Pictures' upcoming movies. So even if it's not that level of sophistication, think about what a malicious insider, just one individual within the organization, might be able to gain access to. Part of the challenge for organizations like Sony Pictures here is that documents and emails are a particular type of asset. They're unstructured data, and unstructured data is growing at an enormous rate. Now, when we talk about unstructured data, we're talking about information that doesn't have any predefined data model. It's not organized in a formal structure such as a database behind an application. It's very often text heavy and contains a lot of valuable information, but it's spread over mailboxes and file shares and online collaboration portals. It exists on hard drives, on thumb drives, on people's mobile devices. Unstructured data is very pervasive, very hard to secure, and very easy to lose track of. And this is what the majority of data in an organization looks like. Think about your own organization. Do you actually know where all your unstructured data is? The answer is almost certainly no, because the very nature of unstructured data makes it exceptionally hard to track. And one of the problems associated with having data like that spread over such a broad number of resources is we also run the risk of attacks like this. This is the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, and in early 2016 they were hit with a very serious ransomware attack. I actually talk quite a bit about this case in my Varonis course titled Introduction to Ransomware. And one of the things I pointed out in that course is that because the ransomware was able to get a foothold within the organization and encrypt that unstructured data distributed across their networks, they were then faced with a ransom demand of 40 Bitcoin. Now at the time, that was worth about 17,000 US dollars. So not a trivial amount of money, although as I point out in that course, it was a very small amount of money compared to what the hospital was actually losing whilst their files are encrypted. But it may well have only taken just one insider to get infected, one person opening an email attachment they shouldn't have, or downloading a file they were coerced into clicking on. That one insider may well have been the vector via which the hospital's valuable files got encrypted and held to ransom. Now obviously in this case with ransomware, the asset being targeted was anything that the ransomware could get its hands on. Trade secrets, financial data, employee records, everything we looked at a few slides ago. That's the nature of ransomware. It's indiscriminate that way. And clearly, the objective of the threat actors in this case was to make money. Let's go and talk about some of those objectives as it relates to malicious insiders. When you hear the term insider threat, you probably most likely think about malicious insiders. But malice can take many different forms when it comes to an insider. So let's go and talk about some of those here. So for example, greed. One of the reasons that insiders exploit their position within organizations is because they want to make money. Here's a great example of that. A system administrator had a dream of buying a house and retiring to a seaside town abroad. Unfortunately though, his financial state wasn't really going to enable that lifestyle. So using his privileged insider access, he decided to sell data. In fact, this article talks about how as he was approaching that retirement stage, he received an offer to sell that corporate data. And that money was going to help him realize his dream of retiring in style. Now, inevitably, it didn't quite work out that way for him because obviously he was discovered. But this is a perfect example of where an insider exploits their position for entirely selfish monetary reasons. Another motivation for malicious insiders is revenge. Somehow the insider feels wronged and they want to take out their dissatisfaction at whatever event upset them on the organisation involved. This was the case at Citibank in 2016, and the individual involved here managed to shut down 90% of the firm's networks across the USA. This was a deliberate malicious act, and his motivation was revenge because he just had a bad performance review. He thought he was going to get fired and he decided to beat them to it. Now, what I find particularly interesting here is that he sent an email to a colleague with the message that you see on the screen here. And he says that he wanted upper management to see what the guys on the floor are capable of doing. This to me was really significant in that one guy on the floor was capable of shutting down 90% of a major bank's network. That's enormous, and what it shows us is that there was almost certainly a huge problem of separation of duties. One individual could make very significant changes to an environment without any oversight. Be that as it may, the underlying motivator for this guy was disgruntlement. And when an insider is disgruntled, that can pose some really serious problems to the organization. Let me give you some examples. This is Dan. Dan is disgruntled. Now, why is Dan disgruntled? Well, there are a number of reasons why people may be upset with their organisation. He might have received a poor performance review, just like the guy at Citibank. He might be feeling a sense of inequality. Has he been passed over for promotion? Does he feel that others are better looked after than what he is? He possibly just has a general sense of job dissatisfaction. He may actually not really like what he's doing. These are all factors which can cause Dan to become disgruntled. Now, what's Dan possibly going to do for revenge? As we just saw, it could be causing malicious damage to the organisation. But it could also be a lot more subtle than that. He might grab a bunch of internal files before he heads off to a competitor. Trade secrets, source code, financial and employee information. We just looked at a number of those assets. He may also decide to delete any incriminating evidence. So maybe Dan's trying to cover his tracks, either of his poor performance or of the fact that he's been exfiltrating data from the organisation before he heads off. Disgruntlement and consequently revenge is a really serious problem within organisations, and all organisations have some people with some degree of Dan in them working within the perimeter. Another motivation for malicious insiders is ideological goals. For example, in 2009, Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, began obtaining classified documents whilst working as an intelligence analyst in Iraq. By the nature of his role, he had access to a huge number of classified databases, very valuable information about the US military. Now, Manning had some serious issues with what was going on there, and he consequently decided to leak a huge number of documents to WikiLeaks, 250,000 diplomatic cables, and almost 500,000 army reports. And as we just saw with Sony Pictures earlier on, WikiLeaks made all of this information easily searchable within their website. As with Snowden, if we put aside for a moment whether we do or don't agree with Manning, the fact remains that it's a significant example of the role of an ideological insider. So it wasn't that Manning wanted to make money, nor that he was out for revenge, but his personal belief system fundamentally disagreed with what was going on, and consequently he used his privilege access as an insider to leak those documents. Another example some years later was the Panama Papers. Now, in this case, the individual known as John Doe, who we believe is an insider, but at the time of recording we don't know who John Doe really is, leaked 11.5 million documents totaling 2.6 terabytes worth of data. Even the cables that Manning leaked were only 1.7 gigabytes, so the Panama Papers in terms of volume was absolutely huge. Now, these papers related to very sensitive relationships that the company Mossack Fonseca had with their customers, frequently relating to how large sums of money were protected, dating all the way back to the 70s. And why did John Doe do this? He explained it like so. Income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time. He felt that this was a serious problem in the world. This was his ideology. And he felt that by exposing Mossack Fonseca's practices, he could have some influence over that. At the very least, he could expose what was going on. And when you read this statement here, it is very ideological. The Panama Papers were so significant that even Edward Snowden himself classed it as the biggest leak in the history of data journalism. But as big as that leak was, ask yourself the question, could you actually identify if 11.5 million documents totaling 2.6 terabytes left your organisation? If an insider literally walked in with an external hard disk and loaded all that data and walked out at the end of the day, would you know? Would that activity, say, spike any sort of alert within the organisation? The answer is very often no. So keep that in mind as we talk about the ways that data is exfiltrated from organisations. Politically motivated insiders are another malicious threat. So for example, in mid-2016, we saw the DNC leaks. So the DNC being the governing body of the United States Democratic Party. So this collection of data included over 19,000 emails from 7 key DNC staff members and over 8,000 attachments. There's a lot of attribution for the DNC leaks to the Russian government. Now, there are many theories out there as to why Russia would be motivated to exploit what was almost certainly an insider within the DNC to then obtain those emails and attachments. But the fact remains that they were leaked, and it was very possibly politically motivated. And not only were they leaked, but just as with Sony Pictures and the Manning documents, WikiLeaks made them searchable. So now that information is easily read by anyone with a web browser. So there are 4 examples of what motivates malicious insiders: greed, revenge, ideology, and political motivations. But insiders aren't always intentionally malicious. Let's go and have a look at the risk of unintentional insiders. An insider not setting out to cause any damage to the organisation, yet by virtue of circumstance, that's the position they find themselves in. Let me give you an example. I love this story on many levels, and it's a really good example of how an insider put the organisation at risk. Bob was a software developer, and being a rather creative guy, he came up with an ingenious solution to how to get his job done. He decided to outsource it to a company in Shenyang, China. Now, the way Bob did this is he paid them 20% of his salary. He then FedExed them his RSA token so that they could log in over VPN and connect to the internal network. So now, by virtue of Bob, the outsourcing company in China had become an insider. Now, whilst they were doing Bob's work, he could go off, search the web, watch cat videos, and browse Reddit. Bob wasn't being malicious in this case. He was being irresponsible, no doubt about it. And what he'd ultimately done is introduced a third party to the network, someone who should never have been in that network in the first place. Now, that was a highly negligent, probably somewhat rare set of circumstances. Let's go and look at something a bit more common. Let's talk about Hillary. And Hillary is an insider within an organisation. Now, Hillary is in there doing her job with the best of intentions. She's not malicious. But there are a number of things about Hillary that put the organisation at risk. So let's ask some questions, then look at some examples of where it's gone wrong in the past. So for example, what sort of access rights does Hillary have? Are they excessive? I've seen statements like this before. I'm the boss, so I should inherit all the access rights of all my employees. Because logically in the boss's mind, the boss is saying, because I'm the boss, I can instruct people to do whatever I want them to do anyway, therefore I might as well have the same rights as them. Now this doesn't work so well when one day the boss's kid comes into the office, sits down on their PC and starts deleting files. And of course, because the boss has these excessive access rights, that puts them at even more risk than most of the other people within the organisation. The boss is a higher value asset. The boss should have the least access rights because the boss is the sort of individual that's going to be targeted via things like phishing attacks. And it's really important that we separate seniority and hierarchy from the necessity of what the individual actually needs to do their job. We'll talk more about that later on in the course when we get through to defensive measures. Another question we might ask of Hillary is whether or not she has the ability to install software on her machine. Often there will be individuals within organisations that believe they need this right. The problem, of course, is that when someone can install arbitrary software on their machine, they end up at risk of attacks like this. This is the Jigsaw ransomware, and in fact it's one I talk about in the Introduction to Ransomware course for Varonis. And the problem with ransomware as it relates to Hillary is that if she has the ability to install software on her machine, she's more at risk of getting infected with a product like this. So we really want to ask in cases like hers, does she really need those access rights? The other question we want to ask of Hillary is what her password management practices are like. Is she using weak credentials? The problem here is that if Hillary is using easily brute-forced or reused passwords, she opens herself up to risks like this. In late August 2016, 68 million Dropbox usernames and cryptographically hashed passwords were dumped publicly. This related to a data breach that occurred some 4 years earlier. And at the time, back in 2012, Dropbox had found that another data breach of an entirely different system had resulted in some Dropbox accounts being compromised. They were compromised because accounts were reused. Unfortunately, one of the passwords that was reused belonged to a Dropbox employee themselves. And inevitably what's happened is that that employee has had access to the 68 million accounts which are now floating around the public web. So when we go back to Hillary and ask that question again, is she using weak credentials? It's because of cases like Dropbox why we ask that question. And remember, weak doesn't just mean that it's not easily guessed or it's not too simplistic. It also means that she hasn't used it anywhere else. Another question we might ask of Hillary is whether or not she's a single point of failure. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. In 2015, Ubiquiti lost nearly $47 million. Now, when I say lost, they actually fell victim to what's known as CEO fraud. And what this commonly means is a phishing attack that impersonates the CEO. So, for example, an attacker may send an email to the likes of Hillary and say, hey, we're just starting up a new partnership with a vendor in a foreign country, and we need to transfer a sum of money to them. Hillary looks at it and says, well, it comes from the CEO. They're an important person. Let me make that transfer for them. And going back to the point here with Hillary is that if she is the single point of failure, so there's no one else involved in making this transfer, so no one who's able to double check what she's doing, verify that she is actually responding to a legitimate request, then she becomes that single point of failure and attacks like the CEO fraud become possible. Now, while we're talking about people asking Hillary to do things on their behalf, could she be coerced? So does Hillary have buttons that can be pushed that will make her do things that she wouldn't normally do? So for example, after the Ashley Madison data breach in August 2015, many members of the site received emails like this. This one was forwarded to me from someone who was genuinely a member on the site. This is their personal data here, some of it is obfuscated. And in this case, the attacker is demanding money. This is blackmail. If we go back to Hillary and consider what might happen if someone attempts to blackmail her, or threaten her, or otherwise put her under duress, that she can then be coerced into performing actions as an insider, which she would never normally do. Hillary's not a malicious person, but circumstances have panned out such that this external threat actor has coerced her into doing something that she would never normally do. And finally, collusion. I touched on this earlier on, where the outsider can become the insider if there is someone within the perimeter that can act on their behalf. We have to look at all these questions here and ask ourselves the question, how can we defend against an otherwise good person like Hillary possibly becoming an unintentional insider? Next up, let's go and have a look at how insiders can exfiltrate data. So how do they use that privileged position to take data outside with them back out through the perimeter? This is Molly, and Molly is an insider, and she's decided she wants to take data outside of the organization. How's Molly going to do this? What avenues are available to her? Let's look at some digital ones first. So for example, over the internet. Now obviously, if someone wants to take data out of an organization via the internet, they've got a number of different options. So for example, cloud storage. The likes of Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive, and many others make it exceptionally easy to exfiltrate data over the internet. Many organizations will actually block access to cloud storage resources, but they might still be at risk of services such as email. It's quite common to enable employees to access their personal email from the office. It's part of this work-life balance. But does that then present a risk where the individual can take sensitive internal information and just simply email it out from their browser? That's a pretty simple thing to do with Gmail. There are also many different file upload services, and it's trivial to use these as a channel of exfiltrating data from the organization. Not just services which are accessible in the browser and they're literally a matter of uploading a file, but services such as peer-to-peer torrenting. Many organizations will block that outright because of how frequently they're used for malicious purposes, or at least illegal purposes. But then there are options such as paste services. So a site like Pastebin, where you can literally copy and paste text onto the web. Even GitHub. What a great way of exfiltrating valuable source code if you can just push a local repository straight up into GitHub, probably into your own private repository. Not only are there many services available like the ones you see here on the screen, but they very frequently run over encrypted connections as well. So that then adds another layer of complexity to organizational monitoring. Another exfiltration mechanism that Molly might use is a physical storage device. Now, this is probably one of the things you most frequently think of when you consider how an insider would get data back out of an organization. You just put it on a thumb drive. But the way storage is evolving makes this easier than ever. For example, you can now fit 256 gigabytes on a micro SD card. So now we have a tiny device that you can carry around in an almost undetectable fashion, and it's fitting a huge amount of data on it. Go a little bit larger to a thumb drive and we're now up to 1 terabyte worth of data in a Kingston HyperX Predator. 1 terabyte in a thumb drive that you can fit in your pocket. Go larger again to an external disk and Seagate is now up to 8 terabytes in their Innovate external drive. Now that connects over USB 3.1 as well. You can fill that drive in less than a couple of hours at max transfer rate. That's 3 times the size of the Panama Papers, the biggest leak in history, just in one drive. And again, you have to ask yourself the question within your organization, would you actually know if someone filled one of these devices up with data and literally, physically walked out the door? Now, when we think about these exfiltration mechanisms, it may not even be that Molly is intentionally malicious. She may just be trying to get her job done without realizing the risks. She might have put some work on the drive to take home. In fact, that's what often happens with laptops. People put valuable, sensitive corporate information on the laptop and then they carry it around in a mobile capacity. Sometimes they then leave that laptop in their car. Sometimes the laptop gets stolen from the car, as was the case with Pfizer some years ago. This was 2 laptops sitting in a car, assumably unattended and also unencrypted, and thieves stole those laptops which contained the personal details of 950 Pfizer contract workers. This wasn't an intentionally malicious act on behalf of the insider, but that simple act of taking sensitive data with them as they went mobile put those 950 individuals at risk. Another very effective data exfiltration mechanism, which we all have in our pockets today, is the smartphone. You can fit a lot of data on a modern smartphone, 256 gigabytes on an iPhone 7, and there are more ways than ever to get data onto it. We can tether it via USB, simply transfer the data over the wire. Of course, we could do the same thing over wireless. All of our mobile devices these days offer wireless connections. And if it's not Wi-Fi, it's Bluetooth. It is easier than ever to exfiltrate sensitive corporate information on a mobile device because we're given so many different ways to do it. But it's also not like all of this is just a new problem. If we go back to Molly and think about the ways that she could exfiltrate data in a more analog sense, she could simply just walk out with files. This is what Greg Chung did. He had all of those documents sitting underneath his house, physical files. And even if we're operating in a predominantly digital age now, If the file doesn't already exist on paper, that can easily be fixed. Just print the file out. The problem then, of course, is that files also get left in cars. Sometimes they get stolen out of cars. Sometimes those cars are even police cars. And even though the Office of Police Integrity had state-of-the-art security and the best equipment, it doesn't stop a thief from simply picking up some paperwork left on the seat of a vehicle. Now, even though physical files like Greg had, or printing out reports like the police did in that example, are very analog means of data exfiltration, they're also relatively high bandwidth in that you can fit a lot of density into them. There's a lot of information in a stack of papers. But there are also far more manual ways of data exfiltration. Taking photos, for example. We all have smartphones in our pockets which are camera enabled. And even if we're not taking photos, simply transcribing information from documents. Perhaps Molly can't print the sensitive information she wants to extract, so she simply writes notes about customers and the financial state of the organisation. That is a really, really hard data exfiltration channel to protect against. So that's just some of the ways that Molly or any other insider, be they malicious or unintentional, can take data from the organisation, exfiltrate it. Let's go and start looking at how we're going to defend against the risk of insiders. Let's look at defensive measures. Obviously, we want to protect against the risk of insiders, regardless of whether they're ill-intentioned or not. But before we start getting into the detail of how we're going to do that, let's talk about just how slow organisations usually are to react to insider threats. This information is from the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, and they shared some really interesting figures about how long it takes to discover an insider. Now, both seconds and minutes unfortunately round down to zero. Organisations simply do not identify insiders within mere minutes. It doesn't happen. Or if it does, it's such a rare occurrence that it just simply doesn't even feature on the report. Hours and also days are slightly better. A total of 10% of insiders are discovered within a period of days, but that is still a very small percentage in the scheme of things. Where we start to see the larger volumes is in weeks. 21% of insider threats are discovered within a period measured in weeks. But the bulk of them are discovered within a range measured in months. That's 49% of insider threats. And the remaining 21% are measured in years. So just those last two together mean that 70% of insider threats take months at best to discover. That's obviously a really worrying trend, because insiders can do a huge amount of damage in mere minutes. And when you start measuring in a period of years, such as with the Sony Pictures attack, then you're talking about really serious long-term damage. Let's go and talk about how to defend against it. I want to cover 3 different patterns here, and the first is to detect. Now, the reason we're starting with detect is that for most networks that are usually already very well established, they've already got large numbers of client machines, servers, file shares, and all sorts of other resources that are attractive to an insider. Analyzing what's actually running in those environments, looking at account activity and user behavior, is the best place to start because it's a very low friction exercise. Let's look at it in a bit more detail. This is Andy, and we're going to look at some activities to perform in this detection phase and where Andy fits into the picture. So for example, one of the things that we want to do is map out the existing network. So where does Andy actually have files? Are they on his local machine? Are they on a set of common file shares? Most organizations simply don't know all the places this data exists. Remember, this is unstructured data, and that accounts for 80% of the data within the organization. We want to know where that is, and that's one of the first things to do in the detection phase. Next up is to start looking for sensitive and stale data. Andy has got a bunch of old documents floating around these various file shares. Documents he never touches anymore. They haven't been modified for years. And likewise, some of those documents are actually pretty sensitive. Andy also happens to be a server admin, and he's put the passwords for those environments in those documents. In this discovery phase, we want to get a good sense of where those sensitive documents lie. We also want to identify who's who in the network. So Andy, as I just mentioned, is an administrator, so that almost certainly means he has some privileged access. But it's also the time to look for things like service accounts and executive accounts, which again is a class of account that generally tends to have more access rights than what it actually should. So this part of the detection phase is just helping to map out where everything lies, what's important that we need to know about it, and then who has access to it. After that, the next thing is starting to baseline what is considered to be normal behavior. What does Andy normally access? This is important, and it's part of this growing trend of user behavioral analytics. So looking at how people behave within the network, because the next thing is to start to look at deviations from that behavioral norm. So what's now suspicious? Andy doesn't normally access the HR file share. His elevated privileges have given him access to it, but he's never gone rifling through there before. So when Andy's account starts accessing sensitive personnel files, that's something that you really want to know about because it's not normal. Now, it may be that Andy is trying to deliberately exfiltrate data before heading to a competitor. It may be that Andy's been infected with ransomware and he's an unintentional insider. But by looking at the behavioural patterns and comparing them against the norm, the unusual activity can be flagged and investigated further. And finally, prioritising. So let's start by looking at overexposed sensitive data. Andy has a bunch of user account credentials sitting on his machine. He shouldn't, but he thinks it's convenient. It helps him do his job. But it is precisely this: overexposed sensitive data. Let's prioritize cleaning that up. So that's the first phase. That's detect. Next is prevent. And this prevention phase is where we try to stop insider activity before it even begins. So making sure that individuals simply can't access resources that they shouldn't have access to. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. A good place to start is by looking at account management practices. So for example, when someone gets terminated, let's say it's Dan from earlier on. Dan was disgruntled. Is his account disabled as soon as he gets terminated? Or does he have the opportunity to go back to his desk and start retrieving sensitive documents that he could take to a competitor? Now, once Dan's gone and someone else comes in to replace him, let's give that individual the minimum set of privileges possible during the onboarding process. And that really leads us through to access controls. Let's simplify the permissions. Many organizations have a very complex fabric of group memberships and inherited rights that are extremely difficult to track. Very often, they simply don't know who has access to what. So simplify those and remove any unnecessary access rights, prune them. But perhaps most importantly, and this goes all the way back to the example of the boss inheriting the access rights of everyone beneath them, apply the principle of least privilege. So give each account just enough access rights so that the owner of that account can do their job. Don't give them any more. And that doesn't matter what level the individual is within the organisation. It's something that needs to be applied to the role they're playing. Another control that we can put in place today is digital rights management. DRM solutions have become increasingly popular because they can set policies on things like whether or not a document can be printed, edited, emailed, copied. And when you start to work within a DRM structure, you begin moving away from this unstructured, unmanaged, uncontrolled set of documents that are floating around in all sorts of different locations within an organisation. It starts to put protections around those resources that are so attractive to insiders. And finally, get buy-in from the data owners. We want to know that those who own the documents are aware of those who can access them. So this is going to mean surfacing the entitlements on those documents and making sure that they can be reviewed. Now, of course, that's closely related to some of the previous points, things like simplifying permissions. It's very hard to do entitlement reviews when there's been a mess of permissions applied to the resource. Now these are all controls at a digital level, but also have a think about some of the controls that get applied to physical resources. So something like the printer. How many times have you walked up to a printer in a corporate environment and seen someone else's material sitting on it? How many times has that material been sensitive? You've probably stumbled across things like payslips, performance reviews, other pieces of data that you simply weren't meant to see. Practices such as actually authenticating to the printer and being present at the printer before your workload can be converted into text on paper is a pretty fundamental control. Of course, physical controls go well beyond there, but that's just one example to get you thinking about something which is a very familiar, very common practice, but in fact poses unnecessary risks. And lastly, sustain. Defending against insider threats is not something that you simply set up and leave. It's an ongoing process, and that means supporting a number of key activities. So for example, continuous monitoring. Once you've established behavioural patterns and you're looking for deviations from the norm, that's something that needs to be actively monitored. Any alerts that are flagged need to be received and actioned. When there are deviations from policy and trusted state identified, those need to be caught. And that's a pretty essential component of actually sustaining an environment that is resilient to the threat of insiders. As maturity progresses, there's also the question of automatic quarantining. So are there triggers that might cause some resources to automatically be protected based on the behaviours that have been observed? Earlier on I mentioned stale data. Andy hadn't touched some of those documents for years. Automate the archival of this. And of course, this is an ongoing activity because as time passes, documents will become stale. And by archiving them, it changes the risk profile of who can access them. Automation plays a really key role in this. So automating both the authorization workflow and the entitlement reviews is really important. A great example of where this should happen is when someone leaves the organization, or even when they change roles. They might still be in the same company, but they're moving into a role which requires different rights. These are the sorts of activities that require automation in order to get them consistently right. When these things are a manual process, they will break down. Automation is the only way to ensure they're going to be executed as designed. And finally, also automating access revocation. Think about what happens when the likes of Dan leave an organisation. He almost certainly has access rights to a number of different systems, probably operating somewhat independently of each other. There needs to be a process where his rights are revoked, because without doing that, if he leaves as a disgruntled individual, that puts the organisation at risk. So that's defensive measures: detect, prevent, sustain. Let me summarise some of the key things I covered throughout this course. We did talk about a lot, but there are a few standouts that are messages worth taking away with you. And one of the first points I made was about the perimeter. We've got to get to this realisation that the perimeter is dead. Certainly we have to work on the assumption that it is. By all means, we should still try to protect it as best we can, but we will always have insiders within it. When we think about insiders, think about the sources that they come from. Insiders may be employees, contractors, partners. They may be outsiders proxying through insiders and colluding with them in order to attack an organisation. Insiders are motivated by many different things. Greed, revenge, ideology and politics, just to name a few. And they're not always malicious either. Sometimes insiders are entirely unintentional. The individual with too many access rights who runs the ransomware attached to a malicious email, or a phishing target who falls for the CEO scam. They may be largely innocent in the scheme of things, but you need to treat unintentional insiders as though something will go wrong. Of course, ultimately the insider does frequently want to exfiltrate data as well. And there are plenty of different ways that they can do that digitally: internet, external drives, phones, and then in an analog fashion as well. I kicked off the course talking about Greg Chung with all the Boeing documents that he had hidden under his house. But that also extends to people simply walking out with some printed material. That's a very analog data exfiltration mechanism. And finally, we just looked at defensive measures, and I broke it down into those three categories: detect, prevent, sustain. Break the efforts down into these three phases and prioritize them. Particularly within very well-established networks, it may take some time to get things locked down to the point you'd really like them to be in. Beginning with that detection phase, so just looking at what is happening in the network now, is a really effective way of introducing effective measures. And where you'd really like to get to with that is being able to monitor user behavior. So being able to establish what is normal and acceptable so that you can then identify the behavior that isn't. So they're the key takeaways that I hope you got out of the course. Insider threats are a really serious risk, and it's a growing risk, particularly as the amount of unstructured data within the organization grows too. I do hope you've enjoyed this course. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Troy Hunt.